is Arnold, Edinborough, and I'm the editor of Saturday Night Magazine. Our magazine has concentrated a great deal recently on the questions of minorities. We've had a look at the Negro minority in London, England, and of course the question of the Negro minority in the United States. We are very perturbed about the attitude, the hardening of the attitude towards minorities, particularly in the United States and the Negro question. We're also very much concerned, being a Canadian magazine, about what is happening here in Canada with the French-Canadian minority. The French-Canadian minority is determined to assert itself and to take the rights which they believe are theirs. One of the things that interests me also is the position of the Jewish minority in this country, and in particular in Quebec. And I'm going to talk now with Mr. Saul Hayes, the Executive Vice President of the Canadian Jewish Congress, and ask him whether, in Quebec, where there is a great ferment amongst one minority, whether that minority, in taking its own place in the sun, is riding a little roughshod over the Jewish minority. Mr. Hayes, is there a particular problem for the Jewish minority in Quebec at the present time?
We believe the Jewish community faces some very serious problems. Some are apparent, some are real. The future ones are apparently those which have to deal with the economic position of the Jewish community, the crisis which faces the Jewish community as part of l'effet anglais because of its cultural affinity to the Anglo-Saxon community. In other words, it's a minority within a minority.
Right. In this minority, within a minority, for example, I think about education. Now, what was Bill 60, and I believe is now law, is there any safeguard here for the right of the Jewish minority?
For the first time, there is a statutory recognition of the Jewish community, and that is by stating that in the new Education Act, there will be provision in the Superior Council for a non-Catholic and a non-Protestant, and the promise is he will be Jewish.
Do you regard this as a triumph for your organization, or is this part of the evolution of Quebec?
It's both. It's a petty triumph and a part of an evolution. It's petty because it doesn't meet with the real issue. And the Canadian Jewish community, through the Canadian Jewish Congress, has a long, perhaps tedious fight on its hands to get status for the Jewish community in education, of which this is the first step.
What about civil rights generally? There is a Bill of Rights federally, but what about the provincial matters of civil rights?
The Bill of Rights federally can only affect federal jurisdiction. The real issues of your daily life, your work, your remuneration, your ability to get a job and keep a job, to be promoted, to belong to a club, to go to a hotel, these are all provincial matters. If you only have a Bill of Rights without a corresponding provincial Bill of Rights, you've got very little. And therefore, one of the most important jobs that the Canadian Jewish Congress must do is, in the new reforms of the Constitution, to insist on an entrenched provincial Bill of Rights so that all of these protections can be built into the law and not be at the whim of a majority.
Have you made some representations in this regard to the federal or provincial government?
Indeed, we have, very recently. A few weeks ago, we made a submission to the Parliamentary Commission on the Constitution, a Quebec Parliamentary Commission, and have asked very aggressively, I might say, that two things be done. One, that the Section 93 of the British North America Act, which is the built-in protection for the Protestant and Catholic communities of Quebec, be abrogated, and instead a total community educational picture evolve, which will mean the same rights for everyone and no protection to any individual group. And the second, I should say, is on a Bill of Rights.
Yes. Now, this is a constitutional matter, but it will ultimately depend on the amount of persuasion you can bring to bear politically. What is the political situation now in Quebec? Beforehand, the creditiste and the whole social credit movement was, one might even say, anti-Semitic. Is there still an organized political body that's anti-Semitic in Quebec?
The Social Credit Party federally has shown in the last 10 years no evidences of anti-Semitism. The provincial political Social Credit Party, that is a branch of it, the Union des Electeurs has. This is the troublesome aspect of Quebec politics. We don't fear actually, as part of the crisis we face, the political evolution of Quebec, except only as it affects the economic and sociological pattern. If these were to be guaranteed not to be touched, there'd be no problem, but it's inevitable that a great deal of change will take place economically and sociologically, and these are where the problems mount.
Is there any problem with the creditiste?
There's no particular problem at the moment because the Union des Electeurs happens to be underground. So there's no problem there.
Now, one of the problems that we faced in Toronto recently, and I say we because I'm not a member of the Jewish community, but it affects me as much as it affects you, and that is hate literature. We've had a great flood of it, and we've written about it in Saturday Night. Have you had a similar manifestation of this hate literature in this province?
Indeed we have, Mr. Edinborough. There was a spillover into Quebec, much of it initiated by the same people who were responsible for it in Toronto. It affected university students and selected list of people. I have before me a number of envelopes, and these are the very envelopes in which this anti-Semitic literature, which is portrayed in the background, was contained. Now this represents only, to show you a few envelopes, possibly a tenth or 100th rather of what actually was brought into our office, which in turn is only 100th of what must have indeed been mailed. This contained very scurrilous material, very vicious material. It asked for the elimination of Jews as part of the polity of Quebec. It asked for their actual castration. It asked for their actual concentration, that they be sent to concentration camps.
Now, the Canadian Jewish Congress, I know, nationally has dealt with this. Has your Quebec branch of it done anything at the provincial level?
Since most of it is a matter of federal jurisdiction, it practically all has to be done on a federal basis, both from the point of view of the post office to prevent it being mailed, the Department of National Revenue to prevent it being brought in through importation, and the criminal code in order that it be considered a violation of the criminal law.
Now, you must obviously be on guard against these very clear anti-Semitic things, but what about the fair employment? What about the discrimination? Is there any of this in Quebec still?
Yes, there always has been a matter of discrimination in employment. Latterly, the Canadian Jewish Congress has taken a very vigorous attitude in asking the Liberal Party, as part of its legislation, to bring in a Fair Employment Practice Act. It's been promised in a recent speech from the throne, and we have every feeling that it will. However, laws are not enough. They must be accompanied by goodwill and education. And we've received the support of church groups, the Canadian Legion, the National Council of Women, both on fair employment practices as well as on the prevention of hate literature.
What about the question of embargoes on stores and this kind of thing? Have you had any of that action recently?
There is a generally traditional attitude on the part of a small Quebec storekeeper who, in his desire to keep afloat, has felt that French Canadians should only buy from French Canadians. This is known as the chat chez nous, or buy from among ourselves. This has been serious in small little pockets. Until recently it wasn't very important. Latterly it's become very important. And like these matters of hate literature and discrimination, the real issue, Mr. Edinborough, is not so much what exists at the given moment as what must be done to prevent a massive retaliation economically and a massive anti-Semitism.
It seems to me that that is where the Canadian Jewish Congress and your united appeal really fits in, and perhaps you would just give us a wrap-up of the primary objectives of your this year's appeal.
You can't have a watchdog and an eyes and ears of the community without the wherewithal to carry it on. The Combined Jewish Appeal acts for and on behalf of the community in order to discharge its obligations, which are traditional, to help distressed Jews everywhere, to build a stable Israel, to help North African Jews. In fact, we've just given a guarantee that will involve the Montreal Jewish community in several hundreds of thousands of dollars to bring North African Jews in time, before it's too late, to this country. And we must also have it to be alert, to have staff, to have resources, to have investigatory materials, all in order to retain the status of the Jewish community, to retain its dignity and its position. Without the Canadian Jewish Congress it won't be done, and the Canadian Jewish Congress cannot do it without a successful Combined Jewish Appeal.
And since when you speak for yourself in these matters, you also speak for all of us in the Canadian community, I wish you well with it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.